That was 2014. You can see things have changed a little bit. Okay, so most of you, I guess, will know the OECD. What you probably won't know is that we work in 2-year cycles, and a lot of what I'm talking about is the end of the previous cycle and this current cycle, which started at the beginning of this year. So let me get into it, but thank you for the invitation. It's my first real big event outside of Teams and Zoom since actually during lockdown, I guess. A little reminder, the TRL scale, designed by NASA, I guess, in the 1970s, and in fact, the US Department of Defense started to use the TRL scale for procurement around about early 2000s. There's been a lot of criticism of TRL scale in academic circles, but however we define it, I think the thing on the right here kind of captures it for what I want to be talking about is from basic research at TRL1 all the way through to deployment at TRL9. So that's the project of this biennium is to look at investments along various parts of the bioeconomy. Now, Mary Maxon is sitting here, and at the beginning of this project, she said, Jim, you're going to have a big problem in this because most of our projects rely on hard published evidence, and the problem here will be a lot of this is anecdote. A lot of this is not written down. And hey presto, she was right. So why along the TRL scale? I mean, I made this diagram 2019, I guess, for the first time. And the reason that I'm differentiating here, the first part of the synthetic, engineering biology, the biofoundry, which requires a level of investment, but not as high a level by any means as what we would expect, what we now know to be biomanufacturing. Scale up for industrial biotech, scale out for pharmaceuticals. So these require different levels of investment using different mechanisms. So that's why I wanted to keep these two things separate. But the point is that the synthetic engineering biology promises to bring us a much higher level of sophistication in the design of biocatalysts, which we really haven't done very much of since the start of biotechnology in the United States in about the 1970s. So with that, though, the next two slides are going to say apples and pears. This is a look at some of the work that was being done by our sister organization, the International Energy Agency, looking at the levels of investment across different sectors. And of course, upstream oil and gas, you see, it is still very high levels of investment in US dollars. And right at the end, renewables for transport and heat are kind of dwarfed. But if I continue this, and this is where it's apples and pears, now on to synthetic biology, well, it was doing actually very well for a very young discipline, but 2022 happened. We know the reasons for this. There's been a large dip. Only two things to say about this, really. 10 billion is chump change, and if we expect that this is going to be the revolution in biotech and bioeconomy, this has to ramp up a very great deal for this to be less than chump change. And the second message, I guess, is it's a very small number of countries, and if it is the revolution it's supposed to be, then a lot of countries are going to have to try and play technology catch-up, which isn't easy in this area. It would be easy in something like IT and designing apps. In this area, that catch-up would probably leave a lot of countries being left behind. So that's one of the messages to our governments. This is one of my favorites, and people get tired of me using this from the Milken Institute of 2013, but it kind of says some of the things I've already been saying, is that there are different levels of investment required and different instruments required according to where you are along this, if you like, the stage from research all the way through to deployment. But one of the things we're always talking about for governments is the use of public investment to de-risk private investment. That is typically through PPPs, which we're talking about here today, is the need to protect or de-risk private investments and show that the governments are serious about this by putting their money where the mouth is. However, one of the things we're saying in this biennium is, do we also need to protect or de-risk public investments? What I'm meaning here is, We've been very good in past at just throwing money at small companies and expecting things to pop out of there. Many will fail, some will become the big companies of the future. And the first time I came across this thing about picking winners, I guess it was the early 80s, and I was a rather young, naive scientist, and I said, well, if governments don't pick winners, they either pick nothing or they pick losers. How does that make any sense? But of course, the world is not black and white. The world everything is in a grey area. And I understand why governments are sensitive about this thing about picking winners. But my second bullet there is saying, right, the IEA says we have half the technologies we need to get to net zero carbon by 2050. What my point is, we can't really afford large numbers of failures and expecting small numbers of successes for the future, because in the chemicals industry, 2050 is 2 innovation cycles from now. There is hardly any time. So a lot of academics are going to be unhappy about this kind of language here, but I'm afraid there is a huge amount of brain power locked up in universities, and somehow we have to get away from the idea that the driving mechanism is just scientific excellence. I saw that all through my academic career. Grants are awarded or failed simply on the basis of scientific excellence in the applications. How else should we judge applications for public money? And here are the 2 controversial things right at the bottom. I'm saying now we need scientific excellence and the environmental credentials proven, and techno-economic and energy balance. And that's something that BIC has looked at harder, is also about the TRL transition, how to make it successful, and the complete value chain. And the complete value chain will come back to again, and social impact will come back to again. So the point is, it's not just about de-risking private, we've also got to de-risk public. Now, this is a complicated slide by my complicated Norwegian delegate, but the message is quite clear from him as well, that the investment, especially by the private sector, it's a matter of risk versus return. And I won't go through all of these here, but you can read them, and the slides are available. But if the risk is of making a bioplastic at very huge volumes, then that's a large risk for an investor, and they might say, would I just put my money into very small-scale production of a high-value pharmaceutical? We've seen this kind of thing happen before. So that's definitely one of the risks. And one of the things which has been very big success for BIC is technology risk about scale-up, pilot, and I've put in a bold blue demonstration, and I'll come back to that in my very last slide, but also we'll have a look at my second last slide on what I'm talking about here. And my Norwegian delegate is very, very strong on this thing about systemic risk, and he says quite clearly and quite logically that if you have a value chain, then the weakest part is weakest link, and therefore, why would you give hundreds of millions of dollars to build a fancy, big, shiny biorefinery if you can't guarantee the feedstocks? So the whole thing can fall apart for that kind of reason. So that's why looking at this entire value chain is necessary when you're committing large amounts of public and private money. So we've got 3 slides now, which I'm not going to spend much time on, but the one after the 3 slides I will spend a bit more time on. I'm going to give you, this one here was from a Dutch a report, which I only have a colleague did this for me. The rest, I haven't ever seen it in English before. But the only point I'm making here is, if you expect the private sector to invest when there is regulatory instability or confusion, then that's going to be a very hard sell, because that might be the biggest factor. If there's regulatory risk, instability, then investors aren't going to be very happy about that. Technical barriers, we know all about them, and I've got license from Roger Kilburn to use this quotation as often as I want, because I like it. Roger came from the chemical industry, and he made this comment some years back that in chemistry the feedstocks are concentrated, reactions are fast, and the products come out concentrated. Whereas in biology, it's very often the other way around, or the opposite, if you like. And when you come out with dilute products, you then have to spend heavy money to concentrate products from a large aqueous phase. But we know all about these technical barriers. None of this is news. And is cell-free synthetic biology the long-term solution? We're not quite sure. Right now, I don't see that as being the answer, but we can't predict the future on this. And we wrote this in 2014, formidable financial barriers, very long innovation cycles for new products. I think the first the PHA, the first PHA plastic was discovered in bacteria in 1925, and we have to still get there. And the competition is actually where I've come from, petrochemistry and oil and gas. So I think in the United Kingdom, the petrochemical industry was fully installed in about 1967, and in Germany it was earlier. So they've had lots and lots of time to perfect the processes. The plants are fully amortized, and they have a global supply chain. It's fraught at times, but it's there. And what we're talking about now is a very, very different proposition with daunting capital requirements to bridge the gap from the lab and proof of concept into commercial production. That's it's actually an unfair competition, because this is an industry which is still receiving vast subsidies. The largest subsidy system in the world is in fossil, and it's over 100 years old. So it defies the theory of subsidy, where it should be phased out once an industry is able to stand on its own 2 feet. But this is a competition, and it's definitely not a level playing field. So here's the one I was talking about. I won't name this person because that person didn't want to be named, but this is a person from the biomanufacturing business in the United States. And some of this is a little bit surprising, but good to hear, because in these discussions, some of these problems that we've been talking about have been listed. So this person, who's an insider in the business, first of all says we rely on a tiny number of production strains, and as any biologist will tell you, that is a great danger. E. coli and Saccharomyces might not be the right organisms to do the job, especially E. coli, and too great a reliance on purified sugar, whereas there's nothing like enough to compete on defossilized chemistry. Easier to make high-value, low-volume pharma, and investor risk is lower. I've mentioned that already. But this person talked about impatient money, and the length of bio-based innovation cycle isn't attractive to VC. So that is a great danger. But this is a double-edged sword, because we've been talking about bio-based for an awful long time, and at the same time, investors are saying this is still taking huge amounts of time to bring these things to the market, where the ludicrous argument is apps and IT come out like this. Well, it's a very, very different proposition, of course. And I think the most important one for me here is this voices in the room. I thought that was going to be about the influence of big fossil. But one of the things that was mentioned actually was, if the voices in the room, which governments rely on, are repeatedly the same professors, then you better make sure that those professors have the deployment attitude. Because if they've got the research attitude, they're looking for, again, papers in journals, and their agenda is not what we would call societal goals. And we've had this in biotech for a long time, since I started in 1977, of the Gartner cycle of hope, hype, and disappointment. A guy from Honda a few years ago said to me that at Honda, they under-promise and they over-deliver, and that's been something that they have cultivated over many decades. And I think one of the problems we've had for investors is we make the big hype and the big promises, and then it doesn't come to fruition. The interdisciplinary boundaries, we've talked about a long time as well, the workforce of the future. I read a paper in 2016 from the UK which talked about, it's an interesting phrase, the tyranny of small numbers. And the idea was that local colleges and universities would put on day release courses to train up industrial biotech people, but what they were saying is they can't find a large enough concentration in many regions to make that worthwhile for that college or university. So it's a case of this is a different workforce for the future, and the training has many difficulties to face. My best hope of that is I refer back to my early days of the concept of mechatronics, which I think came out of Japan, which was a very unusual idea at the time of the combination of mechanical engineering with electrical and electronic engineering. And it looked very, very odd as an engineering discipline. But if you think about it, that's how things are made today. It's a combination of electronic with mechanical is how the manufacturing industry works. And then finally, we can all find this far too much and just put it off, and we'll always find some reason for putting things off. And then something that intervenes, like Robin was saying, things intervene. And Ukraine intervenes, and therefore we say, oh, well, let's defer this and kick it down the road a bit because we have other priorities. And I think the message for me is climate change isn't waiting. If we are, climate change isn't. And we have to actually just get on with this, despite what the turmoil is in the world. Right, and now a colleague of mine, Denis Gauvreau, he was developing an R&D and I model for King Abdullah University in Saudi Arabia. I had Denis talk to our steering group for this project a few months back. And he went on to do some of this again in France, in Paris. And he's now doing a similar kind of thing in Montreal. And his point was, with all of this, do we actually have the right model right now? So the central part of this KITS research, which is, as Denis calls it, is very familiar. Your core facilities available to conduct research projects for a lot of companies that can't afford the continuous cycle of purchase of very expensive biotech equipment. And his idea was that startups are brought into this kind of private IRO because if you look at a lot of startups, they're in European parlance, they might be called micro enterprises. They have too many people spending time trying to develop money instead of developing the ideas, and possibly not enough people working on their cash burn. So an awful lot of startup companies will fail, and Denis saying if they can be brought inside the system here. But the critical thing, which was different, is Denis is saying this is an IRO with an investment arm. Now, this would be a hard sell for a lot of governments because the idea here is that this is government cash used to build an expensive system beyond some of the very nice public IROs you find in, say, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and then, say, run it on private lines. But actually, there is a kind of precedent in the green investment banks, which are set up with public money, but they're expected to run like a private bank. But I mean, Denis isn't saying this is the solution. This is looking at, do we really have the right model for doing this in the first place? Now, this is a little fund, I guess you would call it, run out of Imperial College in London. And a very smart thing was done a few years ago in the UK, where they built, I think, 5 public biorefineries and 6 synthetic biology research centres across the country. So up in Edinburgh, you had a mammalian cell system. Manchester was looking at bio-based chemistry. Norwich, where there's a large food industry, it was looking at food. Now, this thing here, my point about putting this up here is, okay, this supports POC, pre-seed and seed funding, but there's also in London this experience in business development and financing. And I think the third point might be the most significant, because like I'm saying, for a small company, constantly changing your equipment, buying it and changing it is an extremely expensive business and would put you out of business. So the idea here is to be able to use these public facilities to do that for you. And one of the people at Imperial was, he published in The Economist a few years ago saying this might be the biotech model of the future, is that biotech companies don't have their own labs and equipment. They simply go to a biofoundry to have those experiments done, and therefore they can spend much more time on their ideas than going out looking for cash, which is a never-ending cycle of looking for new cash for equipment. Now, this is a big jump, and you'd say the guys put this way out of sync here, and I couldn't talk in this about investment without bringing in the IRA. And the only things I want to take from here is that the IRA, Well, when I look at a lot of policy, it's either CCS, it's usually dominated, and there's very little in CCU, and when you see CCUS in a conference, most of the time we're talking about CCS. But here we have the Inflation Reduction Act bringing carbon capture and utilization into the system. Now, in the quotation at the bottom there, I think the most important word is 3 lines down, and it's incentives. And this is a system to incentivize rather than just throw cash, public cash, without really looking for a great deal of return. This is a means to incentivize. Now, this is an old slide, and the back of the head, which is closest to you, was a delegate to the OECD from the US Department of Agriculture. He was a walking encyclopedia of biomass, and he had the opportunity once he was visiting Europe, and we took him to the new biorefinery at Crescentino. And in the discussions that came out of that, we were finding that there were a lot of barriers, a lot of headaches getting that biorefinery up and running in terms of the number of different people and investors that had to be engaged at various stages, and they said to us that the hardest part was debt finance. And Harry, who is the guy from the USDA, asked that question, would a loan guarantee have eased the burden? And the answer was, the probability is that it would have streamlined a lot of these stages of investment and cut out a lot of the stress and made the thing much, much easier to manage. But they weren't around at the time. I believe now in Europe there are these loan guarantees around for this. And this is also an old slide. It's very hard for us to know if we're actually making any impact anywhere. But Harry did say to us that it had been our suggestion at the time that let's change the biorefinery assistance program to be the much larger biorefinery renewable chemical and bio-based product manufacturing assistance program, because if you do that and you don't have a separate mechanism, you don't have to replicate all the administration. You can control costs that way, and it brings automatic political visibility because of the biofuel system. It brings visibility to bio-based products. So moving on, so this is, you can see that the loan guarantees here are for very large sums. We can talk later about if that is actually possible in Europe, because I suspect that 80% is in breach of state aid rules, which would put Europe at a disadvantage, in fact. Now, the private sector. This was another of the speakers to my steering group, Phil DeLuna from Canada, who worked on the Carbon X Prize. Now, I'm not going to labor any points here. One of the things I want you to look at is the time period here, 2015 to 2021. But also the other feature of this for me is the gate staging. And this, again, gate staging things to try and increase the probability of success, is to say at some stage, this isn't making it, so let's not take this further. But more important for me is the criteria which were used at X Prize. So look at the top here is the fully considered costs, all costs over the life of a project, all the risk factors and significant liabilities. And the thing about CCU here is valuable goods and products rather than just storing CO2 underground as in CCS. But look at the third from the bottom is the credibility of the plan to achieve gigaton scale removal. So this is trying to guarantee that the thing is fully scalable, which is locked into these ideas about gate staging. So there are plenty of lessons, I guess, from this about what I was saying earlier. It's really about trying to improve the chances of success. Now, it makes it much more difficult, but like I say, I get the feeling that 2050 isn't far away, and we have to find ways to reduce the number of failures in this. Now, this is the one I think was my second last slide I alluded to earlier. This is almost brand new, and when in my area of work, when I see something from the National Academies of the US, I sit up and take notice. So here we have right at the top here, this utilization of CO2 being attached to societal goals. And I like bullet point number 2 from the point of view, the one I always use here is the US Prohibition Act, which was brought in to reduce the health detriments of alcohol, and it had exactly the opposite effect because it went underground, it went illegal, it was in the hands of the gangs, and it made health problems much worse. So therefore, this is this idea, and we say it all the time about unintended consequences. Anything we say in policy, we would like to think we've looked at what the possible unintended consequences of that might be. You can't be sure all the time because the way that a policy works, you might never catch loopholes which can cause things to go wrong. But the sub-bullet after bullet point 2, we've been saying in the previous biennium, is make sure that if we're making financial decisions now about technologies to lower emissions, that we don't ignore genuine low emissions technologies. That's a bit of a danger. And then that sub-bullet 2 there, I'm thinking of the thing about off-gases from steel. Often steel making doesn't earn a lot of money, but what happens if you start to ferment off-gases from steel making and it starts to be profitable? Then it might not be a great incentive to change the technology for the actual steel making. These are dangers inherent in many different places. Overcoming limitations, I won't labor it because I've been talking about limitations, and you might say, why is it always talking about limitations and not the successes? And the bottom is a quotation from the paper, and that's that thing, again, about the entire value chain. So now comes the positive bit, because at this time you'll be saying, yeah, what's the difference between Jim Philp and a car battery? Well, a car battery has a positive side, but I actually have something, which is the happy birthday message for BIC. Now, Dirk, when I first met you, 2011, you were saying that Europeans have dreadful difficulty in this whole idea about demonstration scale, because once you've built a demo plant, what happens if it's not large enough capacity to influence a market? Which came as a surprise to me, because coming out of Saudi Arabia, it's part of the process. It's lab, it's pilot, it's large pilot, and you go to demo, and nobody asks you why you're doing that. So this was a big issue then, and the message was, Europe is great in research, commercialization goes to Brazil, United States, we don't easily do the deployment. So I'm not even looking at the big green flagships here, I'm looking at these demo plants all over Europe, and I would have to say, if that's what BIC has done, then that's a magnificent achievement from an attitude where Europeans were very reluctant even to do these plants. So I'll finish on that by saying, simply, how many more, not just in Europe, but how many more BICs and how many more BBI-JIUs, CBE-JIUs do we need? I guess the answer, I don't know the exact answer, I think the answer is we need a lot. But so far, after 10 years, I'd have to say this is success. Thank you for your time.